The homework for yesterday was to add another means of authentication. We already have Google, which was very easy. Let's do GitHub. In Firebase, under authentication sign-in method, we have Google enabled. We could enable GitHub, enable it, and then to complete setup, add this authorization callback URL to your GitHub app configuration. And there's a nice link to learn more if you don't know what the heck that means. And why would you? So that takes you to the Firebase documentation for authentication. If you look on the left, you'll see under Web, GitHub, here we are. Open the auth section, enable GitHub sign-in method, specify the client ID and secret you got from GitHub. So what does that mean? On GitHub, on your settings, under your avatar here, settings, there's a section under developer settings for OAuth applications. Register a new application. This would be note herder, in my case, note herder S3 morning. Homepage URL, you do have to put something. You can put your GitHub pages URL, if nothing else. It's not terribly important. It's not going to actually check that that's there, but you may as well put the real thing because it will show it to your users. Application description, you can do that if you want, but the important part is authorization callback URL, which you get out of Firebase. Do not try to highlight this with your mouse, or you will highlight a couple of hidden things accidentally, and it will not work. Take advantage of the fact that they have this nice copy button. Use it. Copy that, paste it in here. That is crucial to making this thing work, because since we're using that pop-up thing, it has to redirect us to something when it's done, and this is what it redirects us to. Register application. And wouldn't you know it, if we scroll up, it gives us a client ID and a client secret. Exactly what Firebase was asking for. Client ID, client secret. Save. Very good. Now we can just continue on with our application. So the GitHub Provider, Firebase auth, GitHub auth provider, not a huge surprise. So in base.js, where we have Google Provider, we can also add export const GitHub Provider equals new firebase.auth.github auth provider. Let's go ahead and add that to our example file as well before we forget. This is the afternoon base.js. Let me switch that out real quick. And in sign-in.js, we have our authenticate method up here. We could just make this take the provider as an argument. And then pass along whichever provider got passed in. We'll import auth, Google Provider, and GitHub Provider. And our existing button for Google, instead of just calling authenticate, we'll call an arrow function that calls authenticate passing in Google Provider. And we'll make another button. We'll give it a class name of GitHub. And an on-click of an arrow function that calls authenticate with the GitHub provider as the argument. Inside the button, we'll say sign in with GitHub. And if we looked at the static version, we had this nicely styled already. Part of it was the class name GitHub. We've already copied the CSS for that. But also we used a font awesome icon. FA-GitHub is the GitHub logo. Stick that inside the button. Let's sign out. And we have two buttons. Sign in with Google, sign in with GitHub. Let's make sure Google still works since we did change the code for that. Looks good. Sign in with GitHub. And of course I should have a totally new set of notes. I need to authorize this app to access my GitHub credentials. Uh-oh. What happened? The error you provided does not contain a stack trace. Account exists with different credentials. Anybody else run into this? Yep. Yep. So if you go into the sign-in method tab in Firebase and scroll down a bit, you'll see one account per email address, which you can change. Notice the error message is here. The error message here is pretty detailed. Let's go ahead and change it. Allow creation of multiple accounts with the same email address. Another thing you could do is handle authentication a little more manually and make it so that it just reuses the same account. You could also, for example, instead of going by the UID, you could go by the email address, but you would still have to allow this to happen. So you could have multiple accounts, but have them hit the same spot in the database by scoping them all by email address instead of by UID or something like that. But for right now, we're happy with just having duplicate accounts. So sign in with GitHub. There we go. GitHub Davies notes. Note. Cool. Go out to my database. Look at my data. Under notes, I see GitHub Davies note and my Google user. So that's pretty easy. So adding other authentication methods wouldn't be hard. And if you don't know quite what to do, you can always just read the docs. Someone was asking about anonymous. To go to authentication, sign-in method, click on anonymous. This is how you enable it. How do you do it in your code? Again, you can look at the documentation. Anonymous authentication. Looks like all you need to do is call auth.signin anonymously. You don't need a provider or anything. So if you wanted to do anonymous sign-in, your authenticate method would just call sign in anonymously instead of sign in with pop-up. Groovy. Add GitHub authentication. Ein Stück Kuchen. Piece of cake. Questions? One little thing that I told the afternoon class they could do if they got bored. There are a couple of opportunities to create new components. Notice header class name equals capital H header. That capital H is a clue that I intended this to be another component. You can make one there. In the sidebar, notice sign out, same thing. Class name equals capital S sign out. Pretty good indication I intended sign out to be another component when I wrote the style sheet. So other things you could do just to separate out the code a bit more into pieces, but no big deal. The next thing we need to do to this thing is add routing. And first, we need to learn all about routing.